Imagine losing almost every battle you fight, watching your own soldiers walk home in the middle of a war, and still ending up as the man who broke the most powerful empire on Earth. That is not a movie plot. That is exactly what happened to George Washington. On a freezing Christmas night in 1776, he loaded 2,400 starving, half-frozen men into wooden boats and pushed them across a river choked with ice straight into a blizzard. On the other side, more than 1,000 professional soldiers were sleeping off their holiday drinks, completely unaware that history was about to slam into them before sunrise. 90 minutes later, the fight was over. 900 prisoners taken, 0 American combat deaths. But here is the part almost nobody talks about. This was not a lucky gamble from a desperate man. This was the opening move of a plan so sneaky, so patient, and so far ahead of its time that the mightiest military on the planet never figured out how to stop it until it was already too late.
Rewind to 1775 in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress just handed a man named George Washington a job that nobody with any sense would have wanted. They made him commander of something called the Continental Army, which sounds impressive on paper, but in reality it was closer to a patchwork of scattered local militias with no shared training, no matching uniforms, no dependable weapons, and barely any money to keep the lights on. Washington had some background from fighting years earlier in the French and Indian War, but nothing in his past came close to preparing him for the storm that was about to hit him. And when you look at the numbers, it is honestly hard to believe he even agreed to take the job in the first place.
Britain was not just strong, it was terrifyingly strong. They had the largest navy on the planet, over 270 warships prowling the Atlantic like they owned it, because in many ways, they did. Their soldiers had been training since they were kids, drilled by officers who came from the finest military academies in Europe. And when their own troops were not enough, they simply paid for more, hiring around 30,000 German mercenaries, most of them from a region called Hesse, on top of the forces they already had. Now, flip the picture. Washington had farmers. He had shopkeepers. He had teenagers who had never once fired a musket at another human being in their life. Many of his men signed up for only 90 days. And when that time ran out, they packed up and walked home, no matter what was happening on the battlefield around them. Try building a winning strategy when your entire army can legally disappear every 3 months, and you have to start over from nothing. In the early days, every single fear people had about this army came true in the worst possible way. The Battle of Long Island in August of 1776 was an absolute disaster. British General William Howe outsmarted Washington from multiple directions at once and nearly pinned the entire Continental Army against the East River with nowhere left to run. Washington had roughly 10,000 men trying to hold the line, and Howe's forces crushed them so completely that the entire revolution nearly ended in one single afternoon. If Howe had pushed just a little harder that same evening, historians agree he probably could have wiped out the rebel army for good. But then something happened that Washington rarely gets enough credit for. A thick fog rolled in low over the East River that night, and Washington used it like a gift from heaven. Working through the darkness, Washington quietly organized a full-scale evacuation using every boat he could get his hands on. Over roughly 9 hours, he moved 9,000 soldiers, along with their horses, artillery, and supplies, silently across the river to Manhattan. British soldiers were stationed less than 600 yards from the exact spot where this was happening, and they heard absolutely nothing. By the time the fog cleared and Howe realized what had slipped through his fingers, the American army was simply gone. That escape alone saved the revolution from ending right there. But more importantly, it taught Washington a lesson that would shape everything he did for the rest of the war. He finally accepted the truth. He could not beat the British in a straight, honest, head-on fight. Not with these numbers, not with this training, not with these supplies. So instead of trying harder to fight like the British, he made the boldest decision of his career. He stopped playing their game entirely.
Military historians later gave this approach a name, calling it the Fabian strategy, after a Roman general named Fabius Maximus, who once defeated the legendary Hannibal, not by charging into battle against him, but by refusing to fight him at all. Fabius understood something simple but brilliant. Hannibal was deadly because his army was incredible at massive, direct confrontations. So Fabius just never gave him one. He shadowed Hannibal's movements, cut off his food and supplies, harassed his men from a distance, and let time slowly wear the enemy down. Washington took that exact same idea and applied it to the British Empire. The Continental Army did not need glorious victories to win the war. It only needed to survive. Every single day Washington kept his army alive and in the field, the revolution stayed breathing. And every extra day the war dragged on.
This is the part that makes Washington's genius so easy to miss if you are only looking for dramatic battle scenes. He understood something the trained British commanders, with all their confidence and aristocratic pride, completely failed to grasp. Time was working in his favor, not theirs. Britain needed a fast, decisive victory to end this cheaply and go home. Washington did not need to win anything quickly. He simply needed to avoid losing everything at once. So while everyone expected him to charge bravely into battle after battle, Washington did the opposite. He retreated across New Jersey. He retreated through Pennsylvania. He pulled back so many times that even his own officers started quietly wondering whether their commander had any real intention of fighting the British at all.
British generals mocked him openly in their letters back to London, treating him like a fumbling amateur who got lucky once or twice. Loyalist newspapers in New York called him a coward and confidently predicted the entire rebellion would collapse within a matter of weeks. Even his own soldiers grew frustrated because men who had signed up to fight bravely for freedom did not expect to spend endless months simply walking away from the enemy over and over again. But while everyone around him doubted his courage, Washington was quietly watching. He was patiently waiting for the British to make the exact mistake he needed them to make. And eventually, they gave it to him. After capturing New York City, the British made the fatal error of spreading their army thin across New Jersey in a chain of small, isolated outposts. They were so confident the war was practically finished that General Howe went back to New York City to enjoy the winter social season instead of staying near the front lines. His officers threw parties. The Hessian troops stationed at Trenton felt so completely safe that their commanding officer reportedly dismissed warnings about a possible surprise attack from the Americans. A local loyalist actually tried to hand him a written note warning that Washington's army was on the move that very night. According to the story passed down through history, he stuffed the unread note straight into his pocket
and returned to his card game. That single unread warning would end up costing him his life, along with the freedom of 900 of his own men.
Washington deliberately chose Christmas night for the crossing because he knew the Hessian soldiers would be celebrating and their guard would be down. The plan called for 3 separate crossings, converging on Trenton at the same time, but thick ice on the river stopped 2 of the 3 groups from making it across at all. Only Washington's column succeeded, and it was brutal. 2,400 men fought the freezing current for 9 straight hours, while massive chunks of ice slammed into their flat-bottomed boats. Horses panicked in total darkness. Cannons had to be carefully hauled across on reinforced ferries, while several boats nearly flipped over completely. They finally reached the New Jersey shore around 3 in the morning, already hours behind the original schedule, and the plan to attack before sunrise was essentially ruined. Washington pushed forward anyway. His exhausted men marched 9 full miles through a brutal snowstorm, and some of them were barefoot because their old shoes had completely worn through weeks earlier. Bloody footprints marked the frozen road behind them as they walked, and 2 soldiers actually collapsed and died from the extreme cold during the march itself, never getting back up again. When they finally reached the edge of Trenton, just after 8 in the morning, the Hessian soldiers had absolutely no idea what was coming. Washington split his men into 2 columns and hit the town from 2 different directions at exactly the same time, throwing the defenders into total chaos and confusion within minutes. The Hessian commander scrambled out of his quarters, trying desperately to organize some kind of defense, but his men were scattered, disoriented, and simply overwhelmed. He was shot off his horse in the streets and mortally wounded before the fighting even had time to fully develop. In less than 90 minutes, it was completely over. More than 900 Hessian soldiers surrendered on the spot, and remarkably, Washington did not lose a single man in combat that day. A young officer named James Monroe, who would later become President of the United States, was among the wounded, having taken a musket ball to the shoulder during the fighting. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory, and Washington was not finished yet. Just 1 single week later, Washington pulled off a deception so bold that it embarrassed the British for a second time in less than 7 days. British General Charles Cornwallis marched south with over 5,000 troops, determined to crush Washington's small force after they reoccupied Trenton. When Cornwallis arrived on the evening of January 2nd, 1777, he found Washington camped behind a small creek and decided to simply wait until morning to finish him off for good. According to multiple historical accounts, Cornwallis confidently told his officers he would trap the old fox in the morning and end this once and for all. Washington had other plans entirely, and they were brilliant. He ordered a small group of men to stay behind that night, keeping the campfires burning brightly and banging shovels into the frozen ground as if the entire army were busy digging new fortifications. It was theater, and it worked perfectly, convincing Cornwallis that the whole American army was still sitting right there waiting for him. Meanwhile, the real army wrapped their cannon wheels in rags to muffle every sound and quietly slipped away down back roads in the darkness. By the time dawn broke, Cornwallis charged confidently into an empty camp, only to realize he had been completely fooled.
Washington had already marched 12 miles north and crashed into the British garrison at Princeton, winning another sharp and unexpected victory against an enemy who had dismissed him as a beaten fox hiding behind a creek.
The victories at Trenton and Princeton did far more than win small pieces of land. They breathed life back into a revolution that had been on the verge of collapse. Enlistments surged almost overnight. Congress stopped panicking and started believing again. But Washington understood that a couple of morale-boosting wins did not change the harsh math of the war. The British were still stronger, still better funded, and still controlled almost every major port city along the coast. So he went right back to his patient, cautious strategy, choosing fights carefully and slipping away whenever the British tried to force a massive confrontation he could not win. Then came the winter of 1777 and 1778, and it might be the darkest chapter of the entire war. Washington's army, roughly 12,000 men, set up camp at a place called Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, just 20 miles from British-occupied Philadelphia. What followed was 6 brutal months that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Soldiers lived crammed 12 to a hut in tiny wooden shelters they built themselves. Food became so scarce that men survived on something called fire cake, which was basically just flour and water cooked on hot stones. Disease tore through the camp without mercy, and roughly 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge. Yet something remarkable and unexpected happened inside that frozen, miserable camp. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived and began drilling Washington's ragged, exhausted troops in proper European battlefield discipline. He barely spoke English and had to rely on translators just to communicate, but he was relentless and completely dedicated to the task. He stood right in the mud alongside enlisted men, personally showing them how to hold a bayonet correctly, how to march together in tight formation, and how to reload and fire their weapons in coordinated volleys. The desperate group of amateurs who limped into Valley Forge that winter marched out in the spring as something the British had genuinely never faced before. A disciplined fighting force with the training of European regulars and the raw motivation of men defending their own homeland. While all of this was happening on the battlefield and in training camps, Washington's other secret weapon was quietly working in the shadows. He built one of the most effective spy networks of the entire 18th century, and he did it with almost no money and a small team of ordinary civilians who had zero formal training. The most famous of these operations became known as the Culper Ring, a group of everyday people gathering intelligence deep inside British-occupied New York City. They used secret code names, number-based ciphers, and invisible ink to hide messages between the lines of completely ordinary-looking letters, invisible unless treated with a specific chemical solution.
One key member of this network ran a simple dry goods shop in Manhattan, quietly gathering intelligence just by socializing with British officers who openly discussed their military plans over drinks, never once suspecting the quiet shopkeeper was memorizing every single word. This information traveled through a careful chain of couriers, including a woman who reportedly used her clothesline near Long Island Sound as a hidden signal system, with the color and number of items on the line silently communicating where the next secret message could be found.
But Washington did not stop at simply collecting information. He weaponized fake information with a skill that would impress modern intelligence agencies today, ordering his officers to write fabricated reports about reinforcements and troop movements that never actually existed, then making sure those documents fell directly into British hands. The single greatest example of this deception came in 1781, and it turned out to be the exact move that finally won the entire war. By that summer, British General Cornwallis had marched his army of roughly 7,500 troops to a small tobacco port called Yorktown, Virginia, where he began fortifying his position while waiting for reinforcements from the British Navy. Washington finally saw the opening he had been waiting years for. But there was a serious problem standing in his way. Cornwallis sat roughly 350 miles south of Washington's position outside New York City. And if Washington simply marched his army south in the open, British commanders would immediately understand what was happening and rush to either reinforce Cornwallis or attack Washington's now vulnerable northern positions.
So Washington launched what might be the single greatest military deception of the entire century. He ordered the construction of a massive fake military camp in northern New Jersey, complete with giant brick ovens large enough to feed thousands of soldiers, and had his troops build boats along the shoreline as if preparing for a direct amphibious assault on Manhattan. He wrote detailed, convincing plans for an attack on New York and made absolutely certain British spies intercepted them, while also marching French troops in obvious formations near New York's outer defenses, where British scouts were guaranteed to see them. British General Henry Clinton completely believed the deception and pulled every available soldier tightly around New York to defend against an attack that was never actually coming. Meanwhile, Washington's real army was already racing south toward Virginia at a speed that seemed almost impossible for that era, covering hundreds of miles in just a few short weeks, while Clinton remained completely fooled.
By the time Clinton finally realized the truth, it was already far too late to do anything about it. A French naval fleet had sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and sealed off any possible escape route for Cornwallis by sea, while Washington's combined force of American and French troops surrounded Yorktown by land, setting up a devastating ring of heavy artillery. The siege lasted about 3 weeks and was absolutely relentless, with cannon fire pounding British fortifications day and night, while conditions inside the British camp grew steadily worse, marked by dwindling food, spreading disease, and soldiers slipping away under cover of darkness rather than face continued bombardment. On October 19th, 1781, over 7,000 British soldiers marched out of their ruined positions and formally surrendered. And when the news finally reached London, the British Prime Minister reportedly,
and he was completely right, because everything that happened at Yorktown traced directly back to a decision Washington made years earlier, the very first time his army nearly got wiped out on Long Island. He never won this war by being the greatest battlefield tactician in history, and honestly, he lost more battles than he actually won. He lost New York, he lost Philadelphia, he lost nearly every major city the British wanted so badly. But he understood something far more important than holding territory. He understood that this war was never really about land at all. It was about outlasting an empire, deceiving them at exactly the right moments, and making every single mile they gained cost them more than they were ever willing to pay. Washington turned weakness into a weapon, turned retreat into strategy, and turned an entire underestimated nation of farmers, shopkeepers, and ordinary people into the force that finally brought the greatest military power on Earth to its knees.